Hey everyone, and thank you for joining us on day 15 of the Disrupt Innovation Festival. We're at the start of the third week now, and today we've got Mick Blowfield here with us doing an open mic session, The Future We've Been Here Before, which is going to be about the way in which different social transformations happen and what this means for thinking about a move from a linear to a circular economy. This is the rescheduled session. We had some technical difficulties last time, but I'm pleased to say that I've got Mick with me and we've been chatting successfully via video and audio for 30 minutes. So I'm very confident that this time we're going to get through the entire presentation and get some of Nick's insight. I know that Mick is extremely keen to get your input into this session, so please do use this opportunity to send in questions. There are two main ways in which you can do that. The first is via the actual Google Hangout question facility, which you'll find either in the bottom left-hand corner of your window, or if you've already clicked on that, then it will be on a right-hand stream down the right-hand side. So please do utilize that function. If you don't have a Google account, you may find that's not available to you, in which case please do send them via Twitter using the ThinkDiff hashtag. That's ThinkDiff with just the one F, and we'll pick those up and feed those through to Mick as well. So there's not much left for me to do besides offering a little bit of an introduction to Mick. Mick is the Professor of Corporate Responsibility at Wolverhampton University, as well as being a Senior Visiting Research Associate at Oxford University and a Fellow at London Business School. He's been an entrepreneur and senior manager in over 20 different countries around the world and has a track record of researching, advising and managing social development programs in countries from the Sudan to Indonesia to the US. He has worked in the private, public and NGO sectors in areas such as human development, international justice and sustainability. His most recent book, Turnaround Challenge, Businesses and the Cities of the Future, is recently out, I believe, and is very much related to this topic. And his current research focuses on the transition of business towards the needs and realities of a prosperous economy. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Mick and thank him for being with us today. Over to you, Mick. Can you hear me, Mick? Sorry while we deal with these very temporary technical problems. Apologies for the slight delay in connecting to Mick. We're just waiting for his audio to come back online. Can you hear me, Mick? Again, to our viewers, I'm very sorry. We've temporarily lost Mick Blowfield. We're just trying to get him back online. I was just speaking to him, so I'm reasonably confident that we're going to get him back online in a moment. To those of you joining us recently from the headliner that's just finished from Mark Miodovnik, we're just kicking off this session, The Future We've Been Here Before, with Mick Blowfield from the Oxford Smith School.
Okay, I heard you then.
Okay, so we've got you back online, Mick. Sorry, I just introduced you, and I was just letting our audience know that we're talking about social transformations in the context of a transition from a linear to a circular economy. So I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mick. And I was actually just telling the viewers how good it is that we didn't have any technical problems this time. So that was well said.
So that was basically the cue for everything to go. Uh, okay, well, thank you very much. Um, Thank you very much for joining us today. It's much appreciated. As Seb said, this has been a technologically challenged session. Couple of questions just while I'm giving the introduction. One question, just to think about how far you have come today, and from where you started, where you woke up this morning, to where you are now. How far is that? And the other is just to take a picture, um, just to take a look at the picture that you should have on the screen. It's the person having the makeup. I can assure you that is not me. Um, uh, who is that person? I just want to get a feel for what kind of audience we have here today. One of the things that everybody on this webinar shares is going to be that um, everybody's got something in common. Wherever you were this morning, wherever you are now, you got there because you had a plan. You made judgment calls about what would get you to where you are. You made judgment calls about things that could go right, that could go wrong. You thought about speed, you thought about cost, you thought about effectiveness. You assessed the plausibility and the risk. All these things. In short, you figured out how best you could get from where you started to where you wanted to be. In grandiose terms, you planned this transition from where you woke up to where you are now. And by and large, I would say that it worked out pretty well. And yet, this kind of logical approach to get from A to B is typically missing when we talk about disruptive innovation. There's a lot of enthusiasm about what we can do. There's a lot of excitement about what could be achieved. But how we get from where we are to where we want to be with the disruptive innovation is not something that gets an awful lot of attention. Seb, can you go on to the next slide? So let's think about first of all where we are now. I'm not saying that innovation never happens. In fact, if you look at the slide that Seb has put up there, you will see three changes that I couldn't have imagined earlier on in my life. When I used to go from my family home into town, which was a sort of half-mile walk down an alleyway, I could not imagine that it would be unacceptable not to let your dog do its business, as we say, to do its business down that alleyway. Going to town from my home was like learning how to slalom through dog poo. And yet now we live in a world where in cities, certainly cities in Europe and North America, where it is unacceptable to allow your dog to do that. If you look at the situation on the right, when I first started drinking, one of the joys of drinking was that I could go to a bar and secretly passively inhale other people's cigarette smoke. That is no longer possible, which is probably a good thing. But it's a change that happened. It's a change that through a mix of nudge and efforts on behavior change, changes in social attitudes, we've gone from a world where it's quite acceptable to smoke in public places to a world where it is now generally considered unacceptable. We have another example at the bottom, although it's in black and white. It is modern day Amsterdam. And modern day Amsterdam is characterized in many ways by bike lanes. Bikes are to some extent revered more than cars in Amsterdam. That is not a situation that has always been there. It's a situation that evolved through a mixture of policies, evolved through a mixture of behavior change, and so on and so forth. So through a process of nudge, through a process of behavior change and so on, we have moved forward. But I would say that all those examples are in many ways trivial change. They're certainly trivial if we look at the kind of changes and the kind of challenges that disruptive innovation is meant to address. We're talking about a world of 9 billion people looming ahead of us. We're talking about a world of rapidly growing global average temperatures. We're talking about a world of governance change and economic shift. We're not talking about a world where dog poo is the major challenge. Let's come back to the picture of Our Lady. The lady here, as I'm sure many of you would have recognized, is indeed Kim Kardashian. We know an awful lot about Kim Kardashian. A couple of weeks ago, Kim was 34 years old. She was born on the 21st of October 1980. Perhaps we know too much about Kim, but for the purposes of this talk, what I want to emphasize is Kim is a unit of time. On the 21st of October 1980, when Kim was born, that's the year when John Lennon was killed. It's the year when Pac-Man hit the arcades for the very first time. It was just before Post-it notes hit the shops. And it was just before the word internet was used for the very first time. In other words, a lot of things can happen in a single Kardashian. So let's think not just as a Kardashian as a unit of the past, but if we move and think about Kardashian as a unit of the future. Seb, can you bring up the next graph? Thanks. Some of you will have noticed that on the news yesterday there was a lot of discussion about the announcements, government announcements on climate change and the importance of addressing climate change, removing fossil fuels from the energy supply by the end of this century. This graph in front of you is a graph from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report from last year. And it's been simplified, but what it shows is two scenarios for what will happen with the global average temperatures. The blue line is if we do everything we possibly can to address climate change, changing our energy supply and so on and so forth, bringing in new inventions, introducing things like carbon capture and storage, introducing things like improved carbon efficiency and cutting down on the amount of energy we use. And you can see there that sometime in the middle of this century, we will just be bordering on a 2 degrees increase, but hopefully keep it under 2 degrees, because if we go beyond 2 degrees, that's when we enter this period where climate change modelers say there will be enormous climate uncertainty, unpredictability, and indeed catastrophe. At the same time, the red line is showing what will happen if we carry on the way that we are. What happens now if we are on that current trajectory? It means that, again, by the middle of this century, we will have gone past 2 degrees. And by the end of the century, we could be bordering on a 6-degree increase in global average temperatures. In other words, we are facing major, major challenges. And so when we talk about the challenges ahead of us, what we do not want to be seeing probably is mixed messages, mixed message is that we must invest, but at the same time we must spend. That's the message that comes through in economics at the moment. Uh, we need to invest. We need to save money in order to pay for the disruptive innovation. But at the same time, we need to spend, because without consumption, the economy will cease to function properly. We need growth at any cost. And yet we are living in an era at the moment where, in OECD countries, but also in Asia, where growth has slowed down enormously. I was at a meeting the other week where representatives of the current British government were talking about this government as the greenest government ever. And in a way, I believe them. They've done a lot in many ways to green the economy, and yet we are decarbonising. We are decarbonising at less than 1% per annum. The current economic system is meant to create greater wealth, and yet we are living in an era of stagnant wages and growing inequality. A lot of talk about green innovation, disruptive innovation being linked to green innovation. And yet green innovation persistently, whether we are talking about smart metering, whether we are talking about shifts to alternative energy, what it does is it seems to raise costs without doing anything for productivity. And I'll come back to this later, but one of the things that stands out about successful innovation in the past and successful transitions is that new technologies either raise productivity or bring down costs. Both of these are ways of improving welfare in society. In other words, what we confront at the moment when we talk about the transition process is that we're kind of in a bit of a muddle. And it's important that this muddle is sorted out now, because, Seb, if you go on to the next slide, what you will see there with the two yellow lines is that between now and the point where we could be going over 2 degrees centigrade of global average warming, that is a period of one Kardashian. Certainly by the end of this century, when we are getting on towards 2 Kardashians, we could be in a situation where we are increasing by global average temperatures increasing by 4 degrees. And of course, climate change is not the only challenge that we face. So this makes it important that we understand transitions and what works and what doesn't. And as the title of this talk says, that we know something about the future, we know what happens in the past. So Seb, if you go on to the next slide, they introduce the first of these models of transition. And that you'll need to click it again, Seb. For some reason it got that. That's it. Thanks. I'm going to begin with ideological transitions. If we think that the path we are on is somehow immoral, it is somehow unjust, if we act more morally, if we act with greater fairness, that if we change our ideological assumptions, maybe we can bring about change. Some of you will be familiar with ideas like prosperity without growth and steady state growth and the limits to growth. These ideas are built around an ideological assumption about transition. Likewise, people that would like to overthrow capitalism, that is an ideological transition, moving from one system to another. Certainly history has many such examples of this. For instance, the French Revolution, from the Age of Enlightenment through to the declaration of the Republic in 1792, that was a period of ideological innovation. And yet, of course, that was quite a long period of time. Hi, I'm on. Sorry, my child minder has just come in. Likewise, if you look at the slide there, what we are talking about there is anti-slavery, the anti-slavery movement. For most of Christendom, for most of the Christian period, slavery was quite acceptable. And yet in a period of 100 years, from the first anti-slavery groups of the 1780s, appearing in places like Philadelphia and London, through to the outlawing of slavery across the Western Hemisphere in 1888, that is a period of 100 years. And that happened despite the fact that slavery remained profitable, despite the fact that it was an economically justifiable system. It was possible, because of this shift in ideology, to get rid of something that was considered morally unjustifiable. But what I'd point out here is that that is a period of 3 Kardashians. And what we are talking about with some of these challenges is something much shorter than that. You can go on to the next slides. So here's our next type of transition that I'd like to point out. And it's the transition that I would call upheaval. Here we have the celebration of the end of World War I. World War I, World War II, these were all moments of great upheaval. The overthrowing of empires, the emergence of new economies, the overthrowing of tyrants, and so on and so forth. At the end of World War I, it took 6 days from when the Ottoman Empire collapsed to the point where across Istanbul there were no police, there was no health services, there was no law and order. It took just 6 days, and yet that was a multi-century empire that had collapsed. In a period of in the mid-19th century, on the Easter Islands, smallpox and tuberculosis wiped out 25% of the people. These are relatively quick. They are certainly less than 1 Kardashian, and they are also huge opportunities for innovation, both during and after the upheaval process. Think of, in Britain, the National Health Service. Across the European continent, the growth of the welfare state. After World War I, the emergence of the women's vote. All of these things were as a result of these major upheavals. But they are certainly hugely expensive. They are sudden, unpredictable, violent. It's very interesting to watch at the moment. If you have kids, they are probably watching things like The Hunger Games and a whole slew of films and books that are of that same genre. And that is upheaval and post-upheaval apocalypse type of mindset. And it's worth remembering that if we think, well, the upheaval is the only way forward because of the size of the challenges that we have and so on and so forth, and given the amount of time that we've got and that everything has to happen in 1 or 2 Kardashians, maybe the upheaval is the way to go forwards. But remember, in the last 10 or 15 years, we have had 2 major economic upheavals in the advanced economies. If we go back slightly further to the last 20 years, we have had major economic upheavals in Asia as well. And these economic upheavals have reinforced more than challenged the status quo. They have not brought about fundamental change of the kind that might be imagined with the disruptive innovation. Have the next slide, sir. So that brings me to the third model of change and transition that I'd like to point to today. This doesn't have a sexy title. It's techno-financial innovation. It's a model that a woman called Carlota Perez developed about 12 years ago now. And she describes a process that you can see on the S shape of that graph there, where over a particular period, typically between 1 or 2 Kim Kardashians, in other words 40 to 70 years, a system goes from where a new set of technologies is starting to emerge. It erupts into the public consciousness, it becomes very frenzied, and then it enters this turning point, and then it becomes deployed. So you have this division between gestation, the installation, and the deployment periods. This has happened repeatedly in the history of industrial capitalism. The top picture on the right is Arkwright's mill, generally considered the poster child technology for early industrial capitalism. And over a period of 40 or so years, British society went from something that was predominantly rural to one where it was very much city-based, where there was industrial manufacture coming on, and so on and so forth. That was succeeded by the age of the railways. Not just the age of the railways, but the age of steam, interconnectedness, exemplified here by Stephenson's rocket. That in turn became the age of steel, exemplified here by Bessemer's steel process, the one that made Andrew Carnegie very rich. And then, perhaps more familiar for many people here, is going to be the age of the automobile, mass production, that between the time of when Henry Ford took the already existing idea of the internal combustion engine and made it not a toy for the rich, but something that the man on the street could afford, and indeed in the process reinvented what the idea of a street was, from being a muddy lane to being something that was tarmacked and cobbled and stretched out for miles. All of that happened in a period of 40 to 70 years, to the point now where we take absolutely for granted not just the car, but the highways, the airports, the existence of the internal combustion engine, and so on and so forth. These techno-financial innovations are recurring features of capitalism. One of the features is that they raise productivity and reduce costs, something that, as I mentioned earlier, green innovation is not promising at the moment. Green innovation is simply going to increase costs. Energy, you will hear it again and again, energy is going to cost more. Productivity is not going to improve because it's just substituting one form of energy with another. Costs are not going to come down. And yet, with techno-financial innovation, it generates wealth, and it has a relatively quick impact. Of course, as we can see here with the turning point, one of the things about it is built into that system is financial frenzy and collapse. What happened with dot-com bubble? What happened to an extent with the financial crisis of 2007-2008? These are recurring features of techno-financial innovation. Everybody puts their money into the new technology to the point where the new technology cannot deliver the returns. Some people will lose a lot of money, but the interesting thing there is the technology itself carries on. It's already been installed, even though there is a lot of suffering attached. There is a new technology that is installed, and it then becomes deployed, the other side of the turning point on that graph. That's where you get the synergy, the maturity, and ultimately the decay. The decay that leads into the next period. Now, one thing that I would point out here with the techno-financial innovation model is that, well, two things I'll point out. On the plus side, as I've said, It promises a process of innovation that is imaginable given the challenges that lie ahead. Change can happen within the period of 1 or 2 Kim Kardashian lifetimes. It promises the possibility of increased productivity or reduced costs, or both. It generates wealth. It can increase people's well-being. And even if there will be financial hardship somewhere along that way, it is a model that is proved and tested. But it is not something that is purely an example of the private sector unleashed. If we go on to the next slide, Seb. This diagram here that you can see is taken from the book that I co-wrote recently, and which part of this transition dialogue is part of the story in that book. And what you will see there is that the transition does require both the engagement of the private sector and of government. It requires engagement of both producers and financiers. Different people have different roles along that process. And so during the eruption phase, when, for instance, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates were launching, were taking the innovations associated with the with the invention of the silicon chip and launching that into a new ICT era, turning that in, they were looking for financiers. They wouldn't get finance from the pension funds. They wouldn't get finance from traditional sources of finance. They got finance from Silicon Valley, but they were also piggybacking on the financial investment that was made by governments into areas like the military, which led into the invention of the internet, and so on and so forth. So there's a mix here. I'm not going to go into that diagram in depth, but that diagram is quite important for understanding how roles people play in that eruption process. So to pull all that together, and we can go on to the final slide here. So, to pull all that together, when we are looking at the turnaround challenge that will allow us to meet the challenges, the social, government, political, economic, environmental challenges that we hear about every day, and yet the solutions seem ever further away. When we think about those challenges, there is a process of transition that would allow us to be optimistic about meeting those challenges, provided we understood what works and what doesn't under different conditions when it comes to transition. I've pointed out 3 models of transition here. I've pointed out the ideological transition. I've pointed out the upheaval most typically associated with war, but also with disease, also with any other kind of major upheaval. And I've pointed out the techno-financial innovation model. You can probably guess by the fact that I've spent longer on techno-financial innovation that that is the one I think is most interesting if we are talking about disruptive innovation. I think the ideological innovation model, although it is spiritually quite appealing, simply is going to take too long. I think the upheaval model has too much hazard involved, even though if we do not act around issues like climate change and the clash and the contradictions between climate change and demographic change and population growth, we may be in a situation where we are facing enormous upheaval, but that would not be a good choice. But if we look back at the history of capitalism, we will find again and again that capitalism steered in the right direction is able to address these kind of transitions in a period that is useful, but it doesn't happen simply by itself. It's not just a question of market forces. It is a question about active engagement, active planning, and all those kind of basic things that you did when you got up this morning and set off out of bed to wherever you happen to be now. And I'll leave it there, so thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, Mick. We have a couple of questions that have come through via the Q&A function. I'd encourage you, we've got another 20 minutes with Mick, if Mick's happy with that, yep, to please send in your questions either via the Google Q&A function, which you'll see either in the bottom left-hand corner of your video screen, or if you already clicked on that, then the right-hand side, or via Twitter, the ThinkDiff hashtag, which is ThinkDiff with just the one F. I sort of wanted to start off with a quick question, Mick, in follow-up to your talk. Do you think it's tempting sometimes, and this is a sort of, I mean, I just wondered if you offer some thoughts on this, to think about transitions and transformations in a slightly linear way? I mean, probably right now that we could point towards, you know, any number of quite significant transitions that are happening that are going to have very large effects on society. Do you think there's a challenge in sometimes in planning for those things when when there's so many different transformations going on at the same time, and that they don't necessarily happen in a strict A to B sense, if you know what I mean?
No, I mean absolutely, and things are a lot clearer in the hindsight than they are when you're actually in the middle of the fray, if you like. But I think one of the issues, what you can say is, if something is not working, probably continuing to pursue that route is not the wisest course of action. And I would say that at the moment, if one looks at mainstream business, if one looks at the politicians, and if one looks at the linear economy as a whole, and I'm kind of mindful here, I've got questions from James Grayson as well on the screen. If one looks at the linear economy as a whole, that is not delivering either a way of addressing the challenges, but it's not succeeding of its own terms either. And it is a model that is very much wedded to the simplistic idea that there is a simple market economy, and the market economy will allocate resources effectively and will deliver these other goodies, whether those goodies be greater wealth, more productivity, reducing costs. It simply isn't doing that. If you look again and again at what's happening in the Western world with wages. Wages are on a slide. They have been in North America. They've been on a slide for 2 decades. It's not delivering greater wealth. All the linear economy seems to me at the moment to be something. It's something that we talk about. If you imagine that you are the barman and you are asked to make a margarita, and early on you made a very nice margarita because you had fresh limes, well, later on you've run out of limes, but you keep squeezing and squeezing the old limes in the hope that you're going to get the same great margarita. It's not going to happen. It's time to move on and think of a different drink. So I think that's one of the challenges with the linear economy. I just want to say something because there's a question here about there's a question somewhere here about the public sector. Not clear why a non-exploitive future should expect no public sector.
Just to read that question, it's from James Grayson, which is linear economy and other exploitative activities are hugely supported by taxes and subsidies. Not clear why a non-exploitative future should expect no public support in future.
Yeah, I'm sorry if that was misunderstood. That is definitely not what I'm saying. I'm saying the opposite of that. There is an idea and I've forgotten the name of the author that talks about this, but there is an idea that I think is very important. It's about the entrepreneurial state. That the state, rather than keep out of economics, which has tended to be the case in Western Europe in recent years, to try and keep back and allow business to do its thing, that actually, if we look at the great innovations, the state has had a huge role. Sometimes it's messed up, sometimes it's invested in the wrong things, but it has always consistently throughout history, going back to early capitalism, industrial capitalism, it has played a huge role. If you think, one example, if you think of Berlioz, when Berlioz flew across the Channel for the very first time, that hugely significant flight, and he set off on his own, but he was accompanied by his wife, who was on a French battleship going across the Channel. And I think that's a really nice image, because the French battleship, with Madame Berlioz on board, was showing the direction to Berlioz of where to go. Eventually they got separated in the fog, and Berlioz carried on, and eventually he landed, and he broke enormously. I think he broke both legs on the landing. It was something crazy. But it's a very nice metaphor to show that government and business, to make real innovations, do work together. I think what is crucial, and this comes back to the slide that I showed earlier, but it's probably not enormously clear, is that at different points in that innovation process, in that innovation evolution, government and business have different roles to play. And it's coming back to what you said, Steb, it's understanding where you are on the journey that is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, thanks for that answer, James. I think thanks for that question, James, and that answer, Mick. I think you're completely right to say that the distinction between what governments spend the money on is very it's very difficult to make anyway. So I think it's a very, very good point that there's no easy answer to that question. It's always a case of balancing and making sure that the balance is right. I've got another question from James as well, which is our collective talent seems to cause global problems but not solve them. Does this mean the past is our guide and not how to do it? And I guess that relates to a general question in response to this talk in general, is that balance or thoughts on how useful the past is to look into the future, and how we plan for the future when we really have no idea what's going to happen in the future.
I think if we say the past cannot tell us anything about the future, that is very, very scary. That would make me very, very pessimistic. If I woke up every day and had to relearn absolutely everything, from how to get out of bed, why to get out of bed, what the thing was with two holes in that was plugged into the wall, and I put my fingers in it because I'd forgotten that it was a toaster, I think that would be a very scary future. Therefore, we have to think intelligently about what happened in the past. I don't think I think what we need to think about quite seriously, and hopefully this has been come through in parts of the talk, is there are things you can learn about, and there's things that you can discard, and there's things that you can pick up on. But I think it would be quite foolish to ignore what happened in the past, and the idea that in somehow we got it wrong in the past. Well, if what the underlying lesson there is, we got it wrong in the past because we have overexploited the planet, with the awareness of that is fairly recent. Consistently, where we have hit upon, with whatever the contemporary state of knowledge was at a particular time about what the planetary boundaries are, we figured it out. We found a way of doing it. I think what is worrying at the moment is, and this comes back to, there is a question later on from Sven Herman about the the linear economy versus the circular economy is we've not thought outside of the linear economy. We haven't had to, and now we do. Then we need to take that very seriously to understand how the circular economy is different from what we've had in the past, but also what can we learn from the past that we can take into a transition towards a circular economy. So that's really, I mean, I think here the lesson, the lesson with techno-financial transition is there is a recurring pattern that happened to take place during a strong period of the linear economy since the dawn of industrialization, and we don't want to repeat the mistakes of that, what we now know are the mistakes of that, but at the same time there are some very good lessons there about what is possible and what is not possible.
Thanks, Pat. Oh, sorry, Mick.
There's another question there, which I think is again from Sven. Is does anyone really say we need growth at any cost?
That's from James.
That's from James. I would say that I just want to put that in because there is a lot of discussion. A lot of people would say, including people indeed from certain economists and certain people in business schools, would say that growth is damaging. My issue with that is, if we go back to John Stuart Mill, he was quite happy with a world without growth. He was talking about in the Victorian times, in the 19th century, he was talking about steady state growth. The issue that we face now with the challenges is, can you move to that economy, a world without growth, in a period of 1 or 2 Kardashians, in a period of, say, something like 40 to 70 years? And if you can't, then why even try? Why even think about that? And the reason why you can't at the moment is because if you took growth out, you could not repay debt. You could not, you would have people defaulting on debt left, right, and centre. That would lead to economic collapse. The default position from economic collapse would not be to shift to a circular economy. It would not be to shift to a world without growth. It would be to shift to a period of enormous upheaval and uncertainty. And I think that is a huge gamble.
Yeah, we have a question from Keith, sort of digging into some of the specifics, I think, of your comments on government. It says, where do you believe government can have the greatest effect in achieving a timely shift to a circular economy? Through pump priming technology innovation, through financial markets regulation, or elsewhere?
I think again it comes back to where are we at any particular moment in the on that S curve. I think the very first thing that government has to do at the moment is to recognise it needs to stand up and be a government and be perhaps not the leader but a joint leader. It cannot simply see its role as giving way to business. Because when it does do that, what it does, it gives way to big incumbent companies. It is very noticeable that the big winners out of the ICT revolution, we may think of Google, we may think of Apple. The big winners out of the ICT revolution were the financial institutions who got the software and got the technology that brought about the 2007-2008 financial crisis, and the oil companies, who are able to explore more quickly in places that were inaccessible before. The biggest computers in the world and the biggest markets in dollar terms for ICT technology at the moment are still the oil and gas companies and the financial services sector. So I think the government needs to realise what is going on and admit that it has a leadership role and not be scared of taking on that leadership role. I think that is very, very tough. I can't see an awful lot of governments doing that. They will talk about a green investment bank. Green Investment Bank in Britain, and I don't know how international the audience is here, but the Green Investment Bank in Britain has a budget at the moment that is slightly less than the budget for the next Pirates of the Caribbean movie. Now, maybe they'll use that money very, very, very wisely, but I think that the challenge is, even if we just take climate change and not all the rest of it, I think we need a bit bigger budget than the budget for the Pirates of the Caribbean. Good show, Johnny Depp.
That's fair enough. I just had a sort of follow-up question from James earlier. We were having that discussion about value of the past, and he's just sort of said that he's added that he wasn't sort of suggesting to ignore the past, rather we should think more deeply about how we repeatedly think and do everything that doesn't actually solve the problem. So a key thing to learn is about our own self-delusion.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and I mean, we do delude ourselves in many ways around this. We delude ourselves in terms of thinking, oh, we've got lots of time to fix this, and we can fix this very, further on down the line. We don't have to act now. I think one of the strong messages just this weekend is time matters in addressing climate change. So if I keep banging on about climate change, that's because that is the main area that I work on. But the transition work that I do is trying to address transition around a multi-dimensional, interconnected crisis. Not just climate change, but the examples I draw off the top of my head tend to be the ones around climate change. But one of the interesting things that I think from a researcher perspective at the moment is to understand what are the actions that will give us the biggest bang for the buck, what I call, and what we call in the book, the jiu-jitsu moves that will get us the biggest transition in the shortest amount of time with the greatest effect. And that's an area where I think we're only beginning to understand what we should be doing. At the moment, there's sort of just starting to be an understanding that certain actions are better than others. But to scientifically approach, this is what will really work, and this is what will give us the biggest impact. That's sort of at early stages.
So I just want to pose a question that's coming from Sven, and that question is, what do you think the role will be of small businesses? Will they better drive change, or do you think that in these sort of transformations you need to wait for bigger corporations and governments?
Yeah, I think that's I'm very interested in the role of small and medium-sized enterprises. I think they've been overlooked in the sustainability debate. They tend to be in the eradication of poverty. They probably get misrepresented because probably too many people get too excited about entrepreneurs. Most people probably don't want to be entrepreneurs. They want to have good, stable jobs. Whereas in the West, we get overexcited in sustainability debates about the role of big incumbent companies, and the white van man, the typical entrepreneur, the typical small business, tends to get overlooked. What would motivate the white van man to be more part of a prosperous green economy? That's not a question that really gets asked very much. So I think there is a huge role. The problem is then we need to break that down. What do we mean by the small business? There's sort of lifestyle entrepreneurs. There's real get up and go, born to be an entrepreneurs. There are those that are necessity entrepreneurs who have no other choice but really don't want to be an entrepreneur, and so on and so forth. What do we mean by that kind of small business? And that is an area where personally, in my own research, I work with both social enterprises and innovation centres and with local governments to understand what would be the role of small and medium-sized enterprises in creating prosperous green economies, and particularly to add to that in small and medium-sized cities. So small and medium-sized enterprises in small and medium-sized cities. Because again, in the same way as Unilever or Marks and Spencer's or Shell will get much more attention than a small company, so too will London, New York, and Paris get a lot more attention than, say, a Wolverhampton or a Bury or a Lyon, and so on.
Thank you very much, Mick. I'm afraid I think we're just about out of time now. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today, Mick, and to answer as many questions as we can get through. I'm sure we'll be very happy to carry this conversation on in our discussion forums and in various places. So as people are not have more they want to discuss on this topic, I'm very happy to set up something in the cafe and also to make Mick aware of what's being discussed in case he has any input into it. So thank you again for your time today, Mick, and thank you for your insights into social transformations and also into uses for Kim Kardashian.
And then just one thing there, Steb. I think I've stuck my email address at the bottom of that final slide.
Okay, yeah, I will.
Feel free to contact me.
I will make that available also on the event page for anyone who has any follow-up questions. For our viewers, I'd just like to signpost a couple of very quick events for you. On Tuesday night, we have Ellen MacArthur speaking at 10:15 GMT time on accelerating the transition to a circular economy. That will be live streamed via the website. And then on Thursday at 3 o'clock GMT time again, we have Sir Ken Robinson speaking on inspiring a generation and the innovations and changes that need to happen in the education system. For those who are not familiar with Sir Ken Robinson, he's a leading education thinker and definitely a session not to be missed. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you again to Mick. Please do stay tuned in the Disruptive Innovation Festival. We've still got a huge number of exciting events left over the next couple of weeks. Thank you again.